With over 75 seas on the planet, one of them is emerging as a worldwide threat.
China's heavy presence in the disputed region is putting the U.S. and its allies on notice.
We're now being surrounded by Chinese vessels. They've sailed really close to us, as close as a few meters from us. That's it. Looks like we have been blocked and are
A
stuck.
threat that could not only devastate the entire Asian region, but also spark a global conflict, potentially leading to World War III. And it could soon happen because of this region in the Western Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea. When you look at this map, you'll notice that the South China Sea is surrounded by countries like China, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Although it falls outside the territorial limits of these countries, this one sea alone is responsible for 21% of global maritime trade. For instance, around 1,000 ships from Singapore pass through this sea to connect with European markets. Countries like the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, and France also rely on this route, conducting billions of dollars in trade annually. But now it seems all of this might come to an end. This red line near the Paracel Islands shows that China is on a mission to take over the entire South China Sea. Because if you follow this red line, claimed by China, it first connects near Malaysia and then extends all the way to Taiwan. And China is making this possible by aggressively building reefs, artificial islands, runways, helipads, communication towers, and everything necessary to control the South China Sea. However, the situation has intensified, as other neighboring countries have begun marking their claim in the same region. There's the Philippine claim line, the Malaysian claim line, and the Chinese claim line, which even intersects with the Philippine claim line. As a result, this overlap has led to aggressive military drills, escalating tensions in the region. But what is so unique about this sea that has made these countries so desperate to stake their claims? Sure, it accounts for 21% of global maritime trade, but the reality is far more complex. From China discovering one of the biggest gas fields to JP Morgan and BlackRock stepping in to secure their share, something significant is hiding beneath the surface. We're going to find out why the South China Sea has become a global issue.
I'm warning you again. Philippine military aircraft, leave immediately, or you will bear forward responsibility for all the consequences.
To understand the entire picture, let's rewind to 1939, during World War II, when Japan took control of a group of islands in the South China Sea, specifically the Spratly and Paracel Islands. After Japan established military outposts there, it began claiming the region since it was unclaimed by any nation. But why these specific islands? Well, what the world failed to discover was already known to Japan. Beneath these islands lie more than 11 billion barrels of crude oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, resources sufficient to rival some of the world's largest suppliers. However, before Japan could fully explore and exploit these resources, something major happened. In 1945, the US Navy attacked Japan's military posts, forcing them to withdraw from the Paracel and Spratly Islands. Although this marked one of the significant moments at the end of World War II, the real threat was far from over. You see, in 1943, during the Cairo Declaration, the US agreed to hand over Taiwan and its neighboring islands to China. And when the US Navy managed to drive Japan out the region, China immediately declared both island groups as their own and deployed troops to protect them. Nonetheless, neighboring countries were not satisfied with this decision. In 1951, during the San Francisco Peace Conference, the USSR suggested that Paracel and Spratly Islands should be awarded to China. Unfortunately for China, the decision was rejected by a vote of 46-3. The reason was simple. The South China Sea lies beyond the territorial waters of neighboring countries and has been used for international trade for centuries. Yet, some events worked in China's favor. For example, in 1952, Japan renounced all claims of sovereignty over the Spratly and Paracel Islands. A few years later, in 1956, North Vietnam's communist government agreed that these island groups should be handed over to China. But 15 years later, in 1969, something happened that shocked the world. A UN-sponsored research team visited these disputed islands and declared that they had found large amounts of oil beneath the seabed. Keep in mind that since Japan left the region in 1945, except China, no country took an aggressive action to claim the South China Sea. Everyone was waiting for a consensus to maintain peace in the region. In fact, there were times when the US even advised the Philippines to avoid conflict with China to preserve peace. However, once the world learned of the UN research team's discovery of valuable natural resources in the region, everything changed. An aggressive stance was adopted by all countries near the South China Sea. For example, the very next year, in 1970, China forcibly occupied the entire Paracel Islands. Then, in 1971, a group of soldiers from Taiwan shot a Philippine fishing boat in the Spratlys. In response, the Philippine president claimed their right over the islands near the Philippines in the Spratly region. A few years later, in 1974, Vietnam, who previously supported China's claim to the South China Sea, followed the Philippines' lead by also stationing soldiers in the Spratly region. Additionally, Vietnamese soldiers took aggressive measures by removing Chinese fishermen from the southwestern Paracel Islands. The situation escalated further when Vietnam tried to persuade China to recognize their sovereignty over the Spratly Islands. Although they were willing to hand over the Paracel Islands to China, in exchange, China disagreed and the Vietnamese government decided to forcibly take over both island groups. So, in short, the real issue originated from the discovery of natural resources and the ensuing battle to claim the incredible resources hidden beneath these islands. But is the South China Sea really worth becoming a major territorial issue? Is it worth spilling the blood of soldiers fighting for resources to feed their countries? Well, if we look at the current situation, you might be surprised to learn that 6 countries now depend on these islands. Specifically, the South China Sea accounts for 14% of the world's fishing capacity, making it one of the greatest sources of income for the people of Vietnam. For example, in 2019, Vietnam exported around 1,500 million kilograms of seafood to 121 countries. And by 2022, Vietnam had become one of the top 5 global seafood exporters since 2000. Now, it's not that Vietnam has not tried to explore its own territorial waters, but with their shores becoming depleted, their fishermen are forced to seek resources in the South China Sea. In terms of oil, Vietnam produces 2,000 tons of crude oil every year from the South China Sea. As a result, in 2009, petroleum accounted for around 14% of the government's income. Moving on to Singapore, although this island country doesn't claim any territory in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation through this route is a major source of their income. Every day, around 1,000 ships from Singapore use the South China Sea to connect with markets in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Additionally, Singapore is the 17th largest goods trading partner of the United States. So, if China takes control of the entire South China Sea and restricts navigation, it could severely impact Singapore's economic power on the global stage. But not as much as it would affect the Philippines, where 15% of their annual oil consumption depends on the South China Sea. On the other hand, Indonesia's population of 280 million people heavily relies on food security from fish, much of which also comes from the South China Sea. Next is Japan, where 42% of sea trade depends on the South China Sea route. Most importantly, in 2020, Japan was the largest liquefied natural gas buyer in the world, importing around 74.5 million tons of natural gas through the South China Sea. Not to mention Asia's fourth largest economy, South Korea, which imports 92% of its energy resources through the South China Sea. So, from a holistic perspective, this region does indeed present a worldwide issue. And it's not just these 6 countries that depend on the South China Sea. Countries like the US and the European Union also rely on imports from this region. For example, the main export partners of the Philippines, Japan, and Vietnam are the United States and the European Union. However, everything changes when China does this.
人民军队党的建设，确保枪杆子永远听党指挥。
The PLA Navy is the largest in terms of numbers of surface ships and vessels.
如果要打的话是要奉陪的，而且是可以作战到底的，可以血战到底的等等。
Many people have expressed fears that we are closer to war than we have ever been in decades. What are your thoughts on this?
In 2011, the Chinese Communist Party published an article in their national newspaper with the headline, "Don't take a peaceful approach for granted." In this article, China warned the Philippines and other neighboring countries that if they didn't agree with their policies, they would be met with bullets and cannons. The most important paragraph of that article stated, if these countries don't want to change their ways with China, they will need to prepare for the sounds of cannons. We need to be ready for that, as it may be the only way for the disputes in the sea to be resolved. But this isn't the first time China has acted against international law. In 1947, when China published the 9-dash line map covering the entire South China Sea, it committed to controlling the entire region. In the following decades, China confirmed this decision through its unacceptable actions. For example, during the 1974 war with Vietnam, China killed more than 100 Vietnamese soldiers and took control of the entire Paracel Islands region. Then, in 1992, when Vietnam accused China of landing soldiers on a reef controlled by Vietnam in the Spratly Islands, and instead of resolving the issue, China seized around 20 Vietnamese cargo ships. In 2009, the situation took a dramatic turn when the US and China clashed over freedom of navigation. The incident occurred when a US ocean surveillance ship was conducting a routine check in international waters, but when it reached the South China Sea, around 5 Chinese ships harassed US soldiers by coming dangerously close to their ship. Surprisingly, when US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton suggested China resolve their territorial dispute,
but we believe the nations of the region should work collaboratively together to resolve disputes without coercion, without intimidation, without threats, and certainly without the use of force.
Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi warned the US to stay out of the picture and not make this an international issue. Now, the US is not intentionally making the South China Sea a global issue. Of course, there are always some personal interests involved, which is why US-based companies like JP Morgan and BlackRock have already collaborated with China for oil exploration in this region. But what matters most is the approach that China is adopting. If the US doesn't collaborate and conduct joint military drills with neighboring countries, there's a high possibility that China could publish a new map tomorrow, declaring the entire Pacific region as its own. Not to mention, China already controls 20 outposts in the Paracel Islands and 7 in the Spratlys region. Furthermore, with its power to create artificial islands, China has added 3,200 acres of new land in the Spratlys region. This means that instead of fighting with neighboring countries, China is creating its own land by following the 9-dash line. And these aren't just ordinary outposts. Some of them have single-barrel 100mm caliber guns, communication towers, and observation towers, while others have perfectly functioning runways for military action. But what about the fishermen of neighboring countries, or the freedom of navigation, upon which around 21% of global sea trade depends? Well, As China is against fishing in this region, an Indo-Pacific defense expert has warned that if fishermen from neighboring countries are completely blocked by China, it could immediately put these countries into food insecurity. When that happens, hungry people won't target China, but rather their own central governments, which could result in the overthrow of the present government and the rise of military rule, a scenario that is already being witnessed worldwide. So, what are your views on the South China Sea? Do you think China will agree to a peaceful solution in this region? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching.